There is a very quiet assumption hidden in the way many people speak about waiting. It sounds harmless, even gentle. The idea that if one simply steps back, loosens their grip, and allows things to unfold, life will eventually arrange itself into something meaningful. As if time, left alone, has intentions. As if the universe were a polite host who just needs space to prepare the room. Waiting, in this sense, feels virtuous. It feels patient, mature, even wise. It carries the tone of surrender without the messiness of uncertainty. And so it becomes easy to believe that by waiting, one has stopped interfering. But notice how often this waiting is filled with tension, how often it is accompanied by a quiet monitoring of outcomes, a constant checking to see whether something has shifted yet, whether the sign has appeared, whether the universe has responded. It begins to resemble something else. Consider, for a moment, something entirely indifferent to waiting. A cloud drifting across the sky. It does not pause because someone beneath it is hopeful. It does not hurry because someone is afraid of rain. It moves, reshapes, dissolves, not because it has decided to, but because movement is simply what happens when conditions change. The cloud does not wait for the universe. It is not in dialogue with it. It does not hold a posture of readiness. It is not preparing itself for a future arrangement. It is not postponing its existence until circumstances improve. And here a quiet contrast appears. Human waiting is rarely empty. It is often crowded with expectation, with mental rehearsals, with imagined futures standing just out of reach. Waiting becomes a posture of anticipation, and anticipation subtly assumes that something is supposed to arrive. This is where a metaphor begins to form. Imagine someone standing at a bus stop, convinced that the correct bus will arrive only if they appear relaxed. They do not check the schedule. They do not step forward to see which buses are passing. They tell themselves that effort would be interference. That intention would somehow disrupt the natural order of transportation. So they stand very still, calm on the outside, carefully neutral, but inwardly alert, watching every bus with sharp attention, wondering whether this one might finally be it. From the outside, it looks like surrender. From the inside, it is meticulous control. The act of waiting, in this form, becomes a way of negotiating with reality. A way of saying, I will not force things, but I will expect them to behave correctly. It is not action, but it is not openness either. It is a suspension filled with conditions. And the longer this posture is held, the more identity begins to gather around it. One becomes the person who is waiting, the one who understands timing, the one who trusts the universe, the one who knows that forcing leads to trouble. This identity feels safe. It feels superior to desperation, to panic, to visible striving. It allows one to remain still without feeling lost. But identity, once formed, prefers consistency. It tightens around its own image. Waiting then becomes something that must be maintained. Not because it feels alive, but because breaking it would threaten the story one is telling about oneself. To stop waiting would feel like betrayal, like impatience, like falling out of alignment. So the posture hardens. Time passes and the waiting acquires weight. Days become intervals measured not by experience, but by absence. Not yet becomes a familiar rhythm. Life is no longer happening now. It is preparing to happen later. Conversations, work, relationships all take on a provisional quality, as though they are placeholders until the real moment arrives. And here, tension quietly enters. Because while one claims to have released control, the nervous system has not. It is alert, scanning, interpreting, reading meaning into coincidences, feeling disappointment when nothing happens, and relief when something vaguely promising appears. The universe is no longer vast and impersonal. It has become a partner whose responsiveness is being evaluated. This is not surrender. It is delayed demand. Control does not always announce itself through force. Sometimes it disguises itself as patience. Sometimes it learns the language of trust and speaks it fluently. But underneath, it remains an attempt to manage uncertainty by postponing engagement with the present. And so waiting, which was meant to free one from strain, becomes its own form of tension. A stretched moment that never quite resolves. A life lived slightly ahead of itself, always leaning toward a future that has been given too much responsibility. At this point, nothing dramatic has gone wrong. There is no crisis, no obvious mistake, just a subtle dislocation, a sense that time is moving, but one is not quite moving with it. And this is where the question quietly lingers, without demanding an answer yet. What is actually being controlled when one says they are waiting for the universe? It may help to notice that control does not always appear as tension in the muscles or urgency in the voice. Often it is much quieter than that. It can feel like restraint, like composure, like someone who has decided to keep their hands behind their back, not because there is nothing to touch, but because touching would feel risky. Waiting for the universe often carries this kind of restraint. There is an unspoken agreement being made. I will not move first, and in return, reality will eventually move in my favor. The agreement is never stated aloud, but it structures the way attention flows. Every moment becomes a test of whether the agreement is being honored. Think of how often people say they are letting go, while still carefully tracking what should happen next. Letting go becomes less about releasing expectation and more about releasing responsibility. As if by stepping back, one can avoid the vulnerability of direct involvement. Here the metaphor of control shifts slightly. Imagine holding a kite. At first, the string is taut. There is clear effort involved. You feel the pull of the wind, adjust your grip, respond to changes. Then someone suggests that the secret is to loosen the string, to trust the wind. So you loosen it, but you do not let it go. You keep the spool in your hand. You continue to feel the tension through your fingers. You watch the kite constantly, prepared to tighten the line the moment it dips too far. You tell yourself you are no longer controlling the kite, only cooperating with it. But the need to hold the spool remains unquestioned. This is the subtlety of the situation. The issue is not the desire for things to unfold naturally. The issue is the silent insistence that they unfold correctly. Waiting becomes a way to maintain influence without appearing to exert it. And gradually, perception begins to narrow. Life is no longer met as it is, but as a series of signals. Everything becomes interpretive. A delayed message is not just a delay, it is a sign. An unexpected opportunity is not just an event, it is confirmation. Neutral moments become frustrating because they offer no guidance. This interpretive posture is exhausting, though it often goes unnoticed. The mind remains slightly forward-leaning, always asking, is this it? Is this what I was waiting for? Experience is no longer complete in itself. It must point elsewhere. Identity deepens its grip here. One begins to see oneself as someone in between. Not stuck, exactly, but not arrived. Waiting becomes a location. A psychological waiting room furnished with explanations, timing, alignment, readiness, patience. These ideas offer comfort, but they also suspend movement. And with suspension comes anxiety, even if it is subtle, because waiting presumes a future resolution, and the future is inherently unstable. It does not arrive according to moral deserving or emotional preparedness. It arrives unpredictably, often ignoring the stories built around it. This unpredictability threatens the very posture of waiting, so the mind compensates by increasing vigilance, by refining its expectations, by adjusting the narrative. If nothing happens, it must mean not yet. If something happens but does not last, it must mean a lesson. Each reinterpretation preserves the posture, even as it drains vitality from the present moment. Notice how easily everyday life becomes background noise in this state. Work becomes something to get through. Conversations become distractions. Even rest becomes strategic, a way to stay receptive. One is not fully absent, but not fully present either. Life feels like a hallway rather than a room. And yet, from the outside, nothing appears wrong. The person seems calm, reasonable, patient. They speak of trust, of timing, of the universe's wisdom. They appear less frantic than those who chase, force, or demand. But inwardly, there is a faint rigidity, a sense that something essential is on hold. That real engagement will begin once permission is granted by forces beyond one's control. Here, control has not disappeared. It has simply been displaced. Instead of controlling events directly, one attempts to control meaning, to control how uncertainty is interpreted, to ensure that waiting itself feels purposeful, justified, and correct. And this raises another quiet tension. Because if waiting is meaningful, then moving without certainty feels irresponsible. Acting without a sign feels like interference. Engagement becomes suspect. Spontaneity feels dangerous, not because it might fail, but because it might break the spell of waiting. So the posture persists, not out of peace, but out of fear of misalignment. At this stage, there is still no accusation to make, no error to point out, only a gentle observation. Waiting has become a way of organizing experience around a future that must validate the present. And the longer this organization holds, the more difficult it becomes to notice that the present was never actually absent. It was simply being overlooked. The question that begins to form now is not whether waiting is right or wrong, but something quieter and more unsettling. What happens to experience when it is always asked to justify itself later? There is a peculiar seriousness that settles in when experience is treated as provisional, when moments are not quite trusted to stand on their own. They must earn their place by leading somewhere else. And so even joy feels conditional. Even rest feels like preparation. This seriousness is rarely acknowledged because it does not feel heavy. It feels responsible. Waiting for the universe often carries this tone, a sense that one must not disturb the flow, that there is a correct tempo to life, and that stepping outside it would create unnecessary resistance. This belief gives structure to uncertainty. It turns not knowing into a managed state. But notice what quietly disappears in the process. Consider how a child listens to the sound of rain, not as a message, not as a sign, not as something that must mean anything, just sound, texture, rhythm. The rain does not promise improvement. It does not delay fulfillment. It does not signal readiness. It simply happens. The child is not waiting for the rain to lead somewhere else. This is not innocence in a moral sense. It is immediacy, a way of encountering experience without placing it inside a timeline of justification. Nothing needs to arrive later to make the moment complete. In contrast, waiting installs a delay between experience and permission. It says, quietly, this is not it yet. And in doing so, it transforms time into a corridor rather than a field. This is where control deepens its disguise. Control, at its core, is not about forcing outcomes. It is about reducing vulnerability, about minimizing exposure to uncertainty. Waiting feels safer than acting because it avoids the risk of being wrong, premature, or misaligned. By waiting, one can say, I did not interfere. One can maintain innocence in the face of disappointment. If nothing happens, it was not because of misjudgment, but because the universe was not ready. This preserves a sense of coherence in the self. Identity, here, becomes carefully balanced. One is not passive, but not reckless, not frozen, but not impulsive. Waiting allows one to occupy a morally comfortable middle space. It feels like wisdom, even when it quietly drains momentum. And the body feels this, even if the mind explains it away. A subtle fatigue emerges, not the fatigue of effort, but the fatigue of suspension. Muscles remain slightly braced. Attention remains slightly forward. The nervous system does not settle because it is always listening for the signal to proceed. Anxiety, in this context, is not dramatic, it is ambient. It shows up as restlessness without urgency, as boredom without freedom, as the strange feeling that time is passing, but nothing is quite happening, even when days are full. Work is done, but it feels disconnected from meaning. Relationships continue, but they feel slightly paused. Conversations circle familiar ground, because deeper engagement feels premature. Everything waits together. And then, paradoxically, waiting begins to demand reassurance. The mind starts to ask whether it is doing waiting correctly, whether it is being patient enough, whether trust is being properly expressed. Even surrender becomes something to monitor. At this point, the original intention to release control has quietly inverted. Waiting has become an activity, a stance that must be maintained, a performance of alignment. The universe, meanwhile, remains unaffected. Events occur. Opportunities appear and dissolve. People change. Time moves forward with no awareness of who is ready and who is waiting. But because perception has narrowed, these movements feel either irrelevant or threatening. They do not fit the script, and so they are often dismissed. This dismissal is subtle. It does not look like rejection. It looks like postponement. Not this. Not now. Not yet. The present is filtered through a future that has been given authority it never asked for. Here, the metaphor shifts again. Imagine standing at the edge of a river, waiting for the water to become still before stepping in. You believe that stillness will make crossing safer. That movement will settle if you are patient enough. But rivers do not wait. They move because they are not deciding. They move because movement is not a problem to be solved. Standing at the edge does not stop the current. It only delays contact. And the longer one stands there, the more the river becomes something to manage rather than something to meet. Waiting for the universe, in this sense, is not openness. It is negotiation. A way of asking reality to behave before one is willing to engage. The tension arises not because waiting is wrong, but because it asks time to provide certainty, and time does not offer that service. So life continues, but it continues slightly out of reach. And now another question forms, even more quietly than before. What would it mean to meet experience without asking it to arrive with permission? There is a subtle relief that comes when one notices that the universe has never been waiting either. Not waiting to reward patience, not waiting to respond to trust, not waiting to confirm alignment. Things happen, not as answers, but as movements. They arise out of conditions that are already in motion. This is not a comforting realization, but it is a clarifying one. Because if nothing is arranging itself in response to one's posture, then waiting loses its strategic value. It no longer functions as leverage. It cannot guarantee timing, meaning, or readiness. It becomes simply another way of standing still. And here, the idea of control loosens, not through effort, but through irrelevance. Control fades not when it is defeated, but when it is no longer needed to make sense of experience. When there is no longer a future required to justify the present. When moments are allowed to exist without being auditions for something later. This does not mean rushing. It does not mean forcing. It does not mean abandoning care. It means noticing that life has been occurring all along, without consultation. People speak, bodies age, work unfolds, moods shift, opportunities appear and vanish. Loss arrives without warning. Joy shows up briefly and leaves without explanation. None of this waits for readiness. None of it responds to spiritual posture. And yet, it happens anyway. When waiting relaxes, not as a strategy, but as a habit that has been seen through something interesting occurs. Time stops feeling like a hallway. It begins to feel textured again, not promising, but present. Moments regain their weight. A conversation is no longer something to get through while waiting for direction. It is simply a conversation. Work is no longer a placeholder for purpose. It is an activity with its own rhythm. Rest is no longer preparation. It is rest. Nothing has been solved. Nothing has been concluded. But the strain of anticipation softens. The universe does not need to be trusted or distrusted. It does not need to be waited on or consulted. It is not a system of rewards responding to proper behavior. It is movement without commentary. And in this light, waiting reveals itself not as surrender, but as an attempt to make uncertainty manageable. To keep the self intact, while time does what it always does, moves forward without instruction. Seeing this does not create certainty. It removes a layer of negotiation. There is no final shift here, no arrival, no correct stance to adopt instead of waiting. Only a small release of seriousness, a recognition that life does not require readiness to proceed, and never ask to be managed from the sidelines. What remains is not a method, but a simpler intimacy with what is already happening, not because it is meaningful, not because it is aligned, but because it is, unmistakably,